This is CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge & Company. Instead of relying on the police for protection these days, too many New Yorkers feel they have to protect themselves against them. My guest is Bob Gangi, an extraordinary activist and advocate, and an expert on criminal justice and law enforcement issues. He directs the Urban Justice Center's Police Reform Organizing Project that he founded to do just that. So, reform the police. Do we start with stop and frisk?
Well, stop and frisk is obviously the tactic that's a notorious tactic that's gotten the most publicity in recent years. But it's really more emblematic than, well, it cuts deep.
One of the results.
Yes. It's emblematic of what we consider to be the primary problem from a policy standpoint, which is the aggressively enforced quota system within the NYPD. So police officers on the street, their job performance is evaluated on the basis of certain numbers. The numbers of stop and frisks, the number of summonses, and the number of arrests that they engage in a given month.
What's the relation? Do they still do CompStat?
They still do CompStat.
And what's the relation?
Well, CompStat is...
It's the other way, isn't it?
Right. Well, CompStat determines... There are a number of purposes, there are a number of functions of CompStat. One is to figure out where are the high crime areas and then make sure you're concentrating as much as you have resources in those areas. CompStat also assesses and evaluates the numbers that I was just talking about. And a precinct captain, the superior officers, the lieutenant and the sergeants, and the officers on the street will be evaluated on the basis, again, of the number of arrests, stop and frisks, and summonses. So that we're just absolutely convinced, based on hard evidence, based on numbers, based on a lot of stories we hear from people, particularly in inner city communities, that cops are engaging in illegal arrests, unwarranted stops and frisks, giving out summonses for people who are not doing anything wrong. So a typical story you'll hear from a 17-year-old, 18-year-old black young man, black boy, a Latino young man or boy saying, I'm standing in front of my building where I live and I get a summons for trespass, or I get arrested for trespass. We heard a story recently from a man who got a summons for crossing between subway cars while the train was stopped. And the officer said to him, the officer apologized to him and said, sorry about this, Jack, but it's the 26th of the month and I have to hit my number. So there's a lot of pressure on the cops to rack up stop and frisk.
What happens to them if they don't hit their number?
There are a variety of penalties that get applied, as we understand it. One is be much harder to be considered for promotion. You might lose vacation time. You might get assigned an undesirable post. You might be moved to a different precinct. So conceivably, you could get high enough up on some kind of blacklist that you could be suspended. So it's very aggressively enforced. Kelly and the officials who are in charge of the department will deny that there's a quota system. They say we have productivity goals because quota system is illegal under state law. But we're in terms of...
Well, what's the difference between a quota system and productivity?
Well,
nothing, right?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of how the police department enforces it, there isn't any difference. So stop and frisk again is probably the most notorious tactic and the most harmful tactic that has arisen out of this overall approach to law enforcement. The approach to law enforcement, I mean, it's driven by the quota system, but it's aggressive, it's harsh, and it's proactive, as opposed to other strategies of law enforcement, which postulates that law enforcement should be primarily reactive. You're reacting to problems as they develop, rather than this almost kind of preventive, proactive law enforcement.
Well, you did, but the old community policing, or the old myth about the friendly cop on the street, that was proactive, wasn't
Right.
it?
Well, it
But
was
a different kind of proactive.
Well, it was proactive in that the operating principle behind it was that the main job of the police officer was not focused on arresting or giving summonses to people. The main job of the police officer was to work with the community to solve problems in that community, so that there would be a collaborative effort, there would be a partnership, and there would be sort of a grounding in the principle that the members of the community, leaders in the community, merchants, clergy in the community were as interested in public safety and community safety as the police were. And so you work with them to identify who the really disruptive people are in the community, who the real criminals are in the community, and those are the people that you target. Things like stop and frisk.
That's one of the things you would like to see.
Yes, exactly. Things like stop and frisk are very indiscriminate. It's in effect, sorry, table. It's in effect, I mean, it seems like it's glib rhetoric to say it, but you're in effect targeting an entire community, or at least an entire population cohort within that community, so that every black or Latino teenager in the inner cities or young man in the inner cities gets identified as a potential criminal and will get stopped in the ordinary course of their day, literally on a trip to the grocery store, running an errand for their mother, going to school, coming back from work.
Do they include girls and young
Not
women?
as much. Not as much. I mean, some young women do get stopped and do get harassed. Some young women have complained about inappropriate sexual conduct and inappropriate sexual touching.
Was the purpose for to find drugs, to find guns? What do they say you're doing it?
The main purpose that
They don't deny that they stop and frisk.
Right, right.
They just
but
deny
they
it's a quota.
won't acknowledge publicly what we think the rationale for the program is. What they'll say is, we engage in stopping and frisking also when the person is engaged in suspicious behavior in the course of committing a crime or has just committed a crime. What we know is that they stop many people, in our view, the vast majority of people who are not engaged in any kind of suspicious activity. So the term that the federal judge has used, who's handling the litigation that's being brought before her, next month is going to be a very important beginning of the trial. She calls it suspicionless stops. And that's what it represents. We are convinced that the theory behind it, and that there is a law enforcement theory behind it, is that you, in effect, by making indiscriminate stops, by targeting a whole age cohort of people, you send the message that since you now know you could be stopped for no reason, you will think twice before you go out into the street carrying contraband, carrying a weapon. So the fact that they actually confiscate so few guns through the stop and frisk program, the NYPD sees that proof that it's working. Because
they're saying that they don't take them with them.
Right. They very rarely will they publicly say this, but this is their view of preventing the possibility of crime. Our point, and the point of a growing chorus of critics, is that there may be some effective outcome in that fewer young men are carrying guns in the street, but you have, in the course of accomplishing that purpose, you have criminalized the community, you have created antagonistic relationships between you and the community. You've made it much more difficult to carry out other kinds of crime-fighting strategies because of that tactic. Plus, it's wrong. It's unconstitutional. It's illegal. And we think that there are other law enforcement strategies, community policing, that could accomplish the same result through a much more benign approach to law enforcement and an approach that's much more respectful of the community that you're protecting.
So what figures has it changed?
What figures?
Yeah, what number of murders, drug arrests?
The police will say that the drop in the number of murders in the city is due to tactics like stop and frisk. We don't accept that as a given, that there's a causal effect. The murder rate was dropping significantly before Bloomberg became mayor, and before there was this kind of very aggressive commitment to stop and frisk.
So what difference was it before and after?
When Bloomberg became mayor, the number of murders, I forget the exact number, was somewhere in the 500s. This past year, 2012, the murders dropped to under 500. During the course of the Bloomberg administration, they have sort of risen and fallen within the 580, 520
So it's
range.
not a really significant.
It's not, in our judgment, it's not a significant change. Any life saved is obviously
Right.
very important. We think there are many other factors that go into the dropping of the murder rate and the dropping of the crime rate that are not directly related to police strategies and not directly related to stop and frisk.
What do you think it is?
The change in the demographics, so there are fewer people in the age cohort that most commonly commit street crimes. We think there's something called the little brother syndrome, where young people saw the damage, for example, that the crack epidemic was doing to the grown-ups in their lives in the mid-'80s into the early '90s, and decided to adopt different kinds of behavior. So maybe they'll smoke a blunt, which is a marijuana cigarette, marijuana combined with a regular cigarette, but they're not going to use crack, they're not going to use hard drugs. We think open admissions at City College has been helpful because there's so many more opportunities for young people of color to
The
advance.
associate degrees and
Right,
stuff.
right.
The technical. Do you,
But there's no way, in our judgment, there's no way to prove
right, that's the case.
that that's the case, or that stop and frisk is responsible for the drop in
Well,
crime.
what percentage of the murders are murders by people who know, you know?
Actually,
familiar?
I do
That's a high
not know the
percentage,
answer to that
isn't it?
question.
Isn't it?
It is a relatively high
Yeah,
percentage, always.
especially with women, I guess
Right,
that's what it.
right.
But we don't want to discount the street
Right.
shooting, which
Right.
are terrible. But the police department is so protective of itself, right?
Right.
Is what's the historic word they use? The blue shield.
The
of
blue wall of silence.
silence. They're coming under so much more criticism. I mean, the whole question now of police officers lying during trials.
Right,
It's amazing.
right.
What are we going to do when that institution has? Well, you feel, don't you, that it has there's less respect for members of that institution now.
I think in certain communities, I've worked on criminal justice and social justice issues for many, many years, as you know, Ronnie. And
We should say that you were the director
of the Correctional Association of
Association,
New York,
yeah.
which is a prison reform organization, up until 2011, when I started
This project.
PROB, the Police Reform Organizing Project. And I remember, this is a number of years ago, we were at the Correctional Association lobbying for repeal of the Rockefeller drug laws.
Right.
And we brought a group of young people, teenagers, with us on one of our lobbying trips to Albany. And somehow or another, the conversation with the legislator got off that subject to the subject of policing. And one of the kid, he was 16 to 17-year-old boy, said, yeah, we have a gang problem in our neighborhood. The color they wear is blue.
Oh, boy.
And this was many years ago. This is before stop and frisk. This is before Bloomberg and Kelly and this huge jump in the use of stop and frisk. So for many, many years in the inner cities, the people who live in those communities, particularly the young people in those communities, have viewed the cops with distrust, with hostility, because of their experience and the way they're treated by the police. And that's a serious problem. It's a serious problem because of the harm it does to those communities. It's a serious problem because of things like stop and frisk and high level of marijuana possession arrests, for example.
I thought they were cutting that. Weren't they not? Wasn't there a question as to whether they were going to persist with that kind of thing?
The last year for which we have numbers is 2011. There were over 50,000 marijuana possession arrests. Nearly 90% of people of color, the vast majority being young black and brown men under the age of 25. The research tells us that the majority of marijuana smokers in places like New York City are actually white people. Is a startling statistic
Right.
that a person in Brownsville stands 150 times greater chance of being arrested for marijuana possession than someone who lives on the east side of New York.
Who may well smoke more, right?
Right, yeah, very possibly. So the police, Ray Kelly, who's the commissioner of the police department, has made an effort to bring down those numbers, and we believe, we don't have them yet, that the numbers for 2012 will show a drop in the marijuana possession arrests, but it's still probably going to come in at an alarmingly high level. The basic approach to law enforcement, well, let me step back and say this. One of the political challenges with this issue is the stark racial and class divide in regard to this issue. most white people, certainly that I talk to, have a very different view of the police than most people of color. Most white people will say, I see a cop in the street, I feel safer. Most black people, I wouldn't say every, but most black or brown people that I speak to will say things like, I see a cop in the street, I cross the other side of the street because I'm worried that there might be some negative interaction or there might be some disrespect coming from that officer.
Just think as a parent how you feel when your kid goes out on the street, and chances are pretty good that they'll be stopped.
Right.
How many of the arrests don't hold once they get to court?
You know, there's no numbers on that. 6% of the people stopped. In 2011, there were over 685,000 stop and frisk. 6% of those resulted in arrests, and nobody's put out numbers on how many of those arrests hold up. And 6% result in summonses. So 12% of the people stopped were in some way or another hit with a punitive response from the police in addition to the stop and frisk.
Right.
You mentioned the feelings of parents. One of my first encounters with this issue was many years ago. My son now, who is 39, so this was over 20 years ago, he was 18. He was about to go to college, and I was talking with a black woman, I remember her name was Deborah, and her son was about to go to college. So I was saying to her, you know, I'm really feeling sad, you know, that our firstborn son is about to leave and we're going to miss him. And I was startled, and I'm not exaggerating, the impression it made on me. I was startled when Deborah said she's happy that her son's leaving home because every day she was afraid that there'd be some problematic interaction between her son and the police and he might get seriously hurt. And it just was striking to me how I always worried about my children, but I never worried about that they were going to have some kind of...
was going to
right. And that what a burden that is on black and Latino parents raising particularly teenage boys in the city. And I've since talked to other parents, black and Latino parents, who confirmed that anxiety. One woman said, I'm not so concerned about in fact, it was Velman at Montgomery, who's a state senator from Brooklyn, who has a son in his early 20s. And Velman had said, I'm less concerned about the gangbangers and the drug dealers. I'm more worried about the police. And that should be judged by the major political figures in the city as an unacceptable reality.
Absolutely.
And that they should begin taking steps to address these problems. Unfortunately, under Bloomberg and Kelly, as we know, they have met those criticisms and those concerns mainly with a kind of political bluster, with an insistence that there may be some disrespectful interactions during a stop and frisk tactic, but these are the kind of things that make the whole community safer. Therefore,
one of the most egregious programs I thought was the TAP program in the Bronx.
Tell me.
That's the one where privately owned buildings are landlords.
Right, exactly.
Isn't that, what's that called, the tactical?
It's also called the Clean Halls program.
Trespass affidavit program.
Right.
That was incredible to me.
Right.
The New York City police would be asked by private landowners, building
landlords,
owners, to police specially their district.
Right, and they're in those buildings, and they then the cops had permission to go into the buildings. They also do it in the public housing projects, and and we know time after time after time that some of the people who get arrested or summonses for trespass, they live in those buildings, or they're visiting a friend who's invited them to the building. Right. We know of instances where friends have stopped visiting buildings because they get stopped and asked for identification, or they've gotten ticketed or arrested. We know of an instance where a young man was taking care of a sick relative, bringing food over and whatnot, was stopped, harassed so often that he made a decision to stop providing that kind of help to the sick relative. And what's interesting from a political standpoint is that in the Bronx, where Robert Johnson is the district attorney, the district attorneys there have stopped accepting without question the trespass arrests, and have established a policy that before they're willing to prosecute somebody on a trespass arrest, the arresting officer has to come down to the courtroom and have an exchange, first-hand exchange, like you and I across the table, with the DA to verify the charge. And the purpose of that is to weed out some of the weak cases where the officer is engaged in either a completely false arrest or an unwarranted arrest.
Making the quota.
Right, exactly.
Now, one of the things you recommend is a separate board. Is it a board?
Some agency
How does it
that
differ from the Civilian Review Board?
Well, the Civilian Complaint Review Board's charge is to investigate individual acts of misconduct or disrespect. The commonly held opinion of the Civilian Complaint Review Board is that it's virtually powerless.
Very difficult.
And hardly ever, its activities, its investigation hardly ever leads to a finding that the individual officer was guilty and that he or she gets sanctioned. Because one of the factors is, in addition to there being under-resourced and understaffed, is that the NYPD commissioner is still the one who makes the final decision about what the sanctions should be. What we and other police reform advocates are recommending is an outside independent agency of some kind that would not only be charged with investigating individual acts of abuse or alleged acts of abuse, would also have the responsibility for evaluating policy and practice and being able to report on policy and practice and put pressure on the commissioner and his or her top people to change policy and practice.
Their own ComStat or whatever.
In a way, that's an interesting way to think about it, their own ComStat. Because right now, one of the reasons, certainly why we think the NYPD has been able to engage in such abuse of authority is that there is no effective outside monitor. And you learn over the years, and again, I worked on prison issues now, police issues, you learned over the years from history that given the kind of power that our prison system has and our police departments have to arrest people, to deprive people of their liberties for long periods of time, have that extraordinary power. If there's no check, an outside independent check, that corruption and abuse is inevitable.
It gets worse.
Right.
Yeah.
That kind of power, and particularly the iconic status that Ray Kelly has, could be a very dangerous thing.
The third, another thing that you're interested in is the court challenges.
Right.
So tell us about that. There's a class action.
There's a class action suit now being heard in federal court. The suits have been brought by some just excellent progressive organizations in the city, the New York Civil Liberties Union, the Center for Constitutional Rights. They're being heard. There are actually 3 separate lawsuits being combined into one. They're being heard by a federal judge whose rulings up until this time seem to indicate that she's very sympathetic to the plaintiffs and very critical of police department practices. So in all likelihood, she will rule against the city and call for certain remedies. Our concern is that Bloomberg and Kelly, as long as Bloomberg continues to be mayor, the city will continue to fight the lawsuit and will appeal what we think her decision is going to be. We don't know for sure.
Well, won't that take a while, though, for that decision to come down?
The case is being heard next month in March.
Is it right?
So I actually can't predict how long it's going to take her for.
What was the ruling she made just recently?
She made a ruling that was very critical of the practices we just talked about, the trespass arrests in the Bronx. And she ordered the cops, she granted the plaintiffs a preliminary injunction, basically ordering the NYPD to stop that practice. Then she lifted the temporary injunction so the police could go back to the practice, because all of the arguments on that case are going to be heard, combined into the case that's going to be, that she will preside over in March. What we would urge, well, we know that it's useless to urge this on Bloomberg and Kelly, given the political stance that they have taken on these issues. But one of the plans that we have and other police reform advocates have is to very aggressively inject these issues into the mayoral debate this year. And what we would urge on all the mayoral candidates is, instead of resisting the direction that this federal court case is taking, is basically say to the judge and say to the plaintiffs, look, we'll come to the table. Let's negotiate a consent decree to begin to resolve these problems and to eliminate things like stop and frisk. and then we'll agree to an outside independent master who would monitor the implementation of the remedies. We think it's critically important that there be some outside authority, whether it's a master appointed by the court, whether it's an agency set up by the city council and whoever the mayor is, or whether it's a committee of the city council to conduct independent reviews and monitoring and issue reports on police department practices.
And it's more, it was interesting also that the court system now is looking into the bail that's set and the uneven results from that.
Right.
So you're beginning to see a more overall critical look at criminal justice to begin with, right?
I think that's right. You're referring to Judge Jonathan Lippman, who's the chief judge in New York, made a speech on the state of the courts about a week and a half ago, and one of the things he called for was reform of the bail system, because so many poor people are detained in jail because they can't make a bail of $500 or less. Our view is reformers like me have always seen the bail system as a form of preventive detention for poor people, because people with resources are almost always able to make bail, and despite the seriousness of the charges, they could walk. It's poor people who get detained, even when the judge is not even thinking that that's his or her goal, is to have this person locked in jail.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because they can't make the very low bail. And we also see that as a function of the problem with policing, because the vast majority of arrests that the police engage in are of low-income people of color. So a principal reason so many poor people of color come into the system is because in New York City, that's primarily who the cops arrest.
And the prisons are by far all the people of color.
Right.
Tell me, before we finish, and we're near the end, who is the coalition? Who are the people you're working with?
We're working with some of the groups I mentioned, Center for Constitutional Rights and New York Civil Liberties Union. We're working with some unions involved in the labor movement in New York City. We're working very actively with leading clergy. We had a forum a couple of weeks ago at the Ethical Culture Society building where 6 clergy people spoke very compellingly about abusive NYPD practices. We have a clergy sign-on letter calling for sweeping reforms.
And you have a website. So
we have a
people are more
website.
interested.
People want to pick up on this. It's the policereformorganizingproject.org. People should also like us on Facebook.
Okay.
Sign a petition that we have on our website.
And generally support.
And generally support the Police Reform Organizing Project. And my email is rgangi at urbanjusticecenter.org. No, rgangi at urbanjustice.org. Thank you, Ronnie.
Thank you, Bob Gangi.
Okay,
and
take
good
care.
luck, because we all depend on it.
Well, thank you very much.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.